A forester found a dying wolf in a blizzard, but the way his life changed shocked everyone. Please write what city you're from. We're curious to know where our listeners are. When the blizzard became a solid wall, hiding everything, he knew if he stayed even a moment longer, he wouldn't make it home. The taiga didn't forgive delays. The wind cut his face and stole his breath, and the snow lashed at his eyes like a handful of sand. Every step took effort, as if an invisible force was pushing him back. The forester walked, leaning on a heavy pole, thinking of only one thing: reaching his small cabin where dry firewood waited by the stove. But suddenly another sound cut through the wailing wind. It was a dull, drawn-out sound like a moan. The man stopped, listened, and his heart fluttered. No wind, no creaking trees. It was a living voice. He took a step to the side, then another. The snowdrifts came up almost to his knees, heavy and sticky, and every movement was a struggle. The sound repeated a little closer. And then he saw it. In the middle of a snow-covered hollow lay a wolf, half buried in the snow, huge, with thick fur that had turned white from the frost. Its breathing was raspy and shallow, its eyes cloudy, with no malice in them, only exhaustion. It looked as if it was about to give up. The forester's heart sank. He had lived his whole life among animals and was used to each having its own law. A wolf is a predator, strong, proud, and cruel. How many times had he seen them tear apart their prey? How many times had he heard stories of packs traveling for miles, slaughtering everything in their path? And yet he couldn't just walk past. He knelt beside it. Snow packed into his sleeves, and the cold instantly pierced to his bones. The wolf didn't try to get up. It just turned its head and looked. There was something strange in that look. No fear, no rage, just a silent acknowledgement that the end was near. The forester ran a hand over its scruff. The fur was coarse, damp, and icy. He could feel a weak, barely perceptible tremble under his fingers. "It's alive," he said in a low voice, though there was no one else around. The snow kept falling and falling. The wind howled as if urging him to leave. Go away. But something inside wouldn't let him abandon the animal. He knew that if he left, in the morning there would be nothing but a frozen clump of fur. He used his shovel to clear the snow from around the body. The wolf was heavy, much heavier than he expected. The muscles hidden beneath its hide were stiff from the cold, and every movement of the animal was met with a groan. The forester wrapped his arms around its chest and pulled it toward him. At first, the animal gave a slight twitch, but it had no strength to resist. And so, he lifted it, straining with his whole body. Step by step, he trudged along the path. The wolf hung in his arms like a sack. Sometimes he felt the animal trying to breathe deeper, but each breath was a wheeze. The blizzard grew thicker. A white haze stole the world, and it seemed they were walking alone in some kind of void. His legs sank in the snow, his shoulders ached, his breath came in gasps, but he didn't stop. A strange stubbornness grew inside him. He didn't even understand why he was doing it. A wolf, an enemy, a predator, a killer. But at that moment, it was just a living creature that needed help. The way seemed endless. Snow stuck to his face and froze on his eyelashes. His lips cracked from the cold. Sometimes it felt like he was about to collapse. But each time his strength failed, he felt the warmth still breathing in his arms. Weak but real. And he kept going. Finally, the dark silhouette of the cabin appeared ahead, small and solitary, but now their only salvation. He dragged the wolf to the porch, pushed the door open with his shoulder, and a swirl of snow rushed into the house with the cold. Inside, it smelled of dry firewood, old resin, and bread crusts. He laid the animal on the floor by the stove, where the embers were still glowing, and quickly threw on some logs. The flame came to life, hissed, and filled the room with an orange light. The wolf lay still, but its eyes were open. The forester warmed some water and brought an old bowl. The animal tried to lift its head but couldn't. Then he moistened his palm with the warm water and brought it to its mouth. The wolf licked it very carefully and then lowered its head again. He didn't sleep a wink that night. He sat by the stove, listening to the animal's breathing. At first, it was shallow and raspy, then it became a little more even. The man watched the firelight gleam on the coarse fur and couldn't believe it was real. He knew the wolf might not wake up in the morning, but he kept adding logs, giving it sips of water, and talking to himself quietly. He was as if afraid that if he fell silent, life would leave. The blizzard was still raging outside, but here in the small cabin, next to the stove and the animal, it felt like time had stopped. Morning came slowly, like the warm steam that appears on a window after a long winter. The fire in the stove was dying down, leaving red ember eyes in the hearth, and in their faint light, he could see that the fur on the animal's side no longer had an icy crust. Its breathing became deeper. There was no longer that terrible silence between breaths. I threw in some thin splinters, covered them with birch bark, and the flame rose, unfolded, and licked the cast iron plate with a soft tongue. The warmth spread into the logs, into the walls, into the old floorboards, into my fingers which had gone numb during the night. I squatted next to the wolf and looked at it the way you look at a person who has returned from a long journey. There was a dull awareness in the depths of the animal's eyes. It didn't howl, didn't growl, didn't twitch its paws, it was simply alive. This was the miracle. I carefully reached out my palm to its neck, where I felt a faint pulse. The skin under the coarse fur was warm. A quiet gratitude rose inside me. Not to me but to the warmth, to the stove, to the fact that the blizzard outside had finally decided to subside. There was little time left until dawn. I boiled water, threw a pinch of tea into a mug, sipped the bitter brew and got to work. An old first aid kit lay on the table. It had little in the way of real help, but the usual village remedies always came through. I warmed a handful of lard in my palms, mixed it with crushed dried herbs that held the scent of summer, and gently dabbed the skin on its ears and under its paw. The wolf only twitched an ear but didn't move away. I understood that the boundary between us had shifted. It hadn't disappeared, but it had softened. Outside, the wind gave a dull gasp, and the cabin walls answered softly. I got up, opened the door for a minute to let out the night's stuffy air, and then closed it, leaving the steady breath of warmth inside. The wolf turned its head, watched me with its eyes, and lowered its snout back onto its paws. It became quiet in the cabin, too quiet to continue talking even to myself. I sat down on the bench, closed my eyes, and let my body sink into a short, restless nap. I dreamt I was carrying heavy water in my arms and it kept threatening to spill. I was awakened by a different kind of silence. There was no howling wind in it. It was simple and alive, like the first breath after a long fever. A rustle. I realized I had dozed off for a short time and immediately looked at the wolf. It was lying closer to the stove, having repositioned its paws to get more warmth. Its gaze was clearer. A dark streak of water glistened on the floor next to its mouth. That meant it drank, that meant it wanted to live. I thinly sliced a piece of dried meat, soaked it in warm water, waited for the fibers to soften, and moved the bowl closer. The wolf raised its head and stared. Its throat trembled. It sniffed the food and cautiously took a small piece, chewing as if remembering the process itself. It ate a little more and then stopped. That was enough. A living creature always knows its limits when weakened. People often forget, but wolves remember. I went out onto the porch to look at the morning. The wind had died down. White snowdrifts lay on the bench like piles of linen. The fluffy snow hugged the low bushes, silvered the fence and the roofs. Next to the log corner, a deep imprint of my night's path was pressed into the snow. There were no other tracks nearby, no new living path. We were here together, and this realization suddenly felt light. Returning, I cleaned up by the stove, replaced the floor mat that was soaked with melted snow, and carefully added another log. The cabin smelled of resin, damp fur and warm herbs. The wolf watched my every move not as prey but as if observing the weather. Its attention was calm but precise, as if it was noting everything that could be useful to its body, its strength, its return. The day passed unhurriedly. I did what I would do on any other day, only more slowly and mindfully. I checked the firewood supply, moved the logs closer to the threshold, filled a bag with dry splinters, and put a cast iron pot of soup on the stove so there would be hot food. Every time I walked past the wolf, I found my feet were tiptoeing. In villages, people walk like that around cradles when a baby is sleeping. I, an old mountain forester, walked the same way around a wild animal, and I was surprised at myself and smiled without a sound. Toward noon, it raised its head and looked toward the door. Then it looked at me. In that gaze, there was neither a request nor a command. It was a statement. It's time to go out. I opened the door a hand's width to let the winter light into the cabin and stepped aside. The wolf slowly stood up. Slight shivers ran through its legs. It cautiously shifted its weight from one paw to the other, straightened its shoulders, stretched like a big cat, but without laziness, with an internal calculation of its strength. Took a step. Then another went to the threshold and stopped. It inhaled the icy air, and for a moment, its snout became completely foreign. The wind brought the sense of the taiga, and a depth lit up in the animal's eyes. It went out onto the porch. I stood behind it, not closing the door. It lowered its head to the snow, inhaling the fresh dryness through its nostrils, circled the cabin, lingering on each corner, and returned. Not a single sudden movement, not a single unnecessary step. It came inside, lay down in its previous spot, and I felt something inside me release. It didn't leave, it chose to stay. In the evening, I soaked a little more meat again and added warm broth to the bowl. It ate just as unhurriedly as it had in the morning and stopped again, leaving a portion behind. Then it rested its head on its paws. I noticed a scar on its neck, thin and light like a faded lightning bolt. An old mark, maybe from a snare, maybe from another animal's tooth. Life leaves marks, and those who have lived a lot always have plenty of them. That night, the frost tightened its grip on the ground. The cabin walls creaked like taut bows. I fanned the fire, changed a log, went outside, and looked at the black sky, where the stars lay evenly, like a handful of millet on a dark tablecloth. For a moment, I imagined I heard a distant echo. No, it was nothing. Just the echo of an empty night. I returned to the house, sat down on the bench, and let my memory unspool old images. In my youth I saw wolves often. Then fear was simple and silent. It helped me keep the right distance. As the years went by, fear became respect. Then respect became knowledge. I didn't romanticize them. They lived by rules that they taught no one with words. The forest taught me those rules, the bitter smoke of spring fires, the crunch of snow underfoot, the voices of birds that changed with the days like calendar pages. Now, an animal lay in the cabin that was the law, and in my house, its law sounded like the steady breathing by the stove. Admitting this to myself was not easy, but the forest loves simplicity. It doesn't tolerate complex words if silence will do. The morning of the second day began unhurriedly. I sorted through my gear in the shed, checked the ropes, moved the shovel closer to the threshold, and swept the floor. The wolf already held its head steady, turning it at the slightest sound, sensing my every step. When I moved the bowl of water, it got up, approached, and drank steadily and carefully without spilling. Water is the first sign of a return, food the second, movement the third. Everything was going as it should. Closer to noon, it got up and crossed the cabin. I retreated to the wall, giving it space. It went to the door and sat looking outside. I understood it was time to show it the usual circle around the house. The door opened softly, and the frost hit my face. We went out together. The snow lay smooth like flour. The sun hung low and still. The shadows were long and cold. It walked beside me, slightly ahead, stopping to listen to the thick silence in which movement is always hidden. It paused by the woodpile, sniffing, and also by the old stump. It circled the shed, touching the corner of the cabin with its shoulder, as if marking a silent boundary for itself. When we returned, it didn't glance toward the forest path, and I again found myself breathing easier. In the evening, light streaks of frost stretched across the sky. I broke off some thin twigs so I wouldn't have to fiddle with fire tongs at night, and put the cast iron pot on the edge of the stove in advance to simmer. The wolf was dozing, but its ears were awake. They responded to every change in the wind with a sluggishness, like a tightening spring. The light in the cabin became soft and warm. And in this softness, I suddenly understood that my former solitary life had cracked like ice on a stream when the sun sets in the forest. The crack was clean and silent, but circles spread from it. By the third day, the wolf's strength had increased. It ate more confidently, a little more, but still with half its strength. Animals always take care of themselves after an ordeal. I moved a mat, sewn from old belts, closer to the stove. It lay down on it without hesitation, as if it was its rightful place. In such moments the heart behaves strangely. It seems simple enough. An animal by the stove warmed the home. But a warm wave spreads inside. Like from two words spoken at the right time by a person you've long thought of as silent. I went out to the well to get more water, cleared the path to the door, and threw snow off the buried window. The wind was picking up again. Its voice was lower than on that terrible night, but its stubbornness remained. White needles of frost froze on the lapels of my coat. My hands grew numb as I pulled the bucket from the black mirror of the well. Returning, I looked at the edge of the forest. The forest looked back. There was nothing mystical about this exchange of glances. It was simply life testing life. It started getting up more often, sometimes coming to the threshold and sitting, gazing into the white distance. Sometimes its eyes traced the ceiling beams, as if reading an old book from them. I noticed how the glassy fragility in its movements was slowly disappearing. It was no longer that frozen shadow I had lifted from the snow pit. In the evening, when the blue outside the windows became thick and an orange heart throbbed in the stove, it raised its head to the ceiling for the first time and exhaled a long, almost soundless breath. It wasn't a howl, but rather the breath of a thought. I sat nearby and felt my chest become light. I understood a simple thing. Sometimes it's enough to just have someone nearby, even if that someone is a wolf. In the following days, we established a quiet routine. I would get up in the dark to give the fire a head start, sweep, prepare simple food, go outside, clear the snow from the door, and straighten the roof of the woodpile. It followed me like a shadow, like an extension of the forest's awareness. It needed to be sure that everything here was in its proper place. No show of closeness, no unnecessary movements. Just silent companionship. One day, when the wind was dry and biting, I decided to go to the nearest clearing. I needed to see if a heavy treetop had fallen at its edge and blocked the path. I didn't stay long, but on my way back, I noticed a row of familiar prints on the smooth surface of the snow. It had followed my tracks halfway and returned. Didn't matter why. What mattered was that the tracks lay side by side, two paths going in the same direction. By evening that same day, the sky had been pulled taut with a gray cloth. A fine dust of frost rose in the air, the kind that tickles your nose and settles on your eyelashes. It was a premonition. The taiga rarely gives warnings with words, but its signs are clear. I arranged extra logs by the stove and moved the shovel and warm mittens closer to the threshold. It raised its head and looked directly into my eyes. In that gaze was something that needed no interpretation. It also knew that tomorrow there would be wind and blinding snow. We met this knowledge together. I went to bed later than usual. Sleep didn't want to come, as if it feared being swept away by a draft. I stared at the fire for a long time, watching it breathe steadily. Fire loves action. If you take care of it in time, it's grateful. The wolf lay with its paws stretched out, and its breathing deep inside matched the crackle of the logs. I caught this shared rhythm and let it guide me. When the darkness outside the windows became thick and the fire in the stove was whispering quietly, I thought for the first time since I lifted it from the snow about what would happen next. The thoughts didn't go far. The forest never lets plans linger for long. It lives in short steps. Morning, evening, food, warmth, the path to the well, the path to the threshold. That's the way it should be. I also thought about the people who listen to stories during long winters, about those who love good and true tales where a harsh life suddenly makes room for a miracle. I thought that someday I would tell them everything exactly as it was. And if someone recognizes a part of their own life in this quiet companionship, let them stay with me longer. Let them listen and believe that kindness given without expectation knows how to return. Sometimes not right away, sometimes through a blizzard. If this resonates with you, don't get lost. Stay close. There is no loud call in these words. There is only our shared fire here. Towards morning, the cabin grew colder. I got up, threw on logs, swept the ashes, and took the bucket outside. I inhaled the frost so deeply that it stung my chest. The sky hung low. The snow began to fall in fine pellets that got into the folds of my clothes and rustled in my collar. I went inside, closed the door with my elbow, and shook the snow from my felt boots. And at that moment it got up, came to the door again, and sat down, its tail resting on the mat. It sat like a guardian who knew its place. I said nothing. It didn't either. We didn't need words. That's how the first part of our strange shared winter ended. The wolf didn't leave. It accepted the warmth and stayed. I did my usual simple work and knew there was another living breath in the house. The world had more of the kind of silence that heals. There was more simplicity inside. Sometimes that's enough to change a lot, even though everything around seems the same. And yet, somewhere in the depths of my consciousness, that very thing I didn't yet dare to think about was already stirring. A light, almost weightless premonitory thread. It stretched from a future blizzard, where the snow would blind your eyes, where every step would be heavy, where your strength would say, "That's enough," to a place where the forest tests a person seriously. But I'll tell you about that later. For now the cabin was warm. A flame was breathing in the stove, and by the stove lay a gray animal that had once restored my simple faith that living things are drawn to living things. The days passed unhurriedly, the snow lay deeper and deeper, the nights grew quieter, and the days were short and austere. The forester got up early, lit the stove, brought in water, chopped logs, and fed the animal with the meat scraps he always saved for hard times. The wolf started to get up. At first it was uncertain, trembling all over, as if the ground was swaying under its paws. Then it became firmer, steadier, but it didn't leave. It seemed that each time it reached the door, it stopped, as if remembering the cold emptiness waiting beyond the threshold, and then it would turn back and lie down by the stove again. The man watched it and didn't know what to think. On one hand, the wolf was an enemy. It had always been one. On the other, its breathing now filled the cabin with the same warmth as the fire in the stove. Sometimes at night, he would wake up with a strange feeling. In the darkness, he would hear the animal's heavy, steady breathing and realize that he felt calm, as if it were not a predator nearby, but someone of his own. One morning he opened the door and saw it. The wolf had gone out onto the porch and stood still. The snow glittered in the sun's rays. The frost sparkled and the trees stood in silver. The wolf raised its snout, inhaled the air, and something ancient and untamable flashed in its eyes. And yet it didn't run away. It slowly turned, looked at the man, and returned to the cabin on its own. At that moment the forester's heart sank. He understood. The animal had made a choice, and this choice was unfathomable to the human mind. More days passed. The wolf grew stronger. Its fur began to shine again. Its old dignity and strength returned to its movements. But now, every step felt cautious, as if it was afraid of losing the place where it had been accepted without anything being asked in return. The forester began to talk to it out loud. The words were simple and mundane, about the weather, the firewood, old chores. The wolf listened silently, sometimes blinking, sometimes slightly moving its ears. And that was enough for the man to feel he was not alone. And yet deep down he knew this was just the beginning. The taiga never gives peace for long. Winter was gaining strength. The snow fell in layers, covering the roofs of cabins and villages far below. It made the forest deaf and secluded, as if the world had shrunk to a few trails and the walls of the cabin. The forester felt that a real test was coming soon. A blizzard, a thaw, hungry animals. The taiga always kept trials in reserve. The wolf was getting stronger. Steps became firmer. Its fur shone with a silver sheen in the light, and its eyes glowed more clearly. It no longer resembled the frozen shadow the forester had pulled from the snowdrift. And yet it didn't leave. During the day it would go out into the yard, circle in the snow, linger at the edge of the forest, but each time it would return to the cabin. The man watched and felt a strange feeling each time, as if it wasn't just an animal next to him but a guardian who had been entrusted to stand by him until its time came. Sometimes at night the forester would wake up to muffled sounds. A branch breaking under the weight of snow, or a distant owl hooting. The wolf would raise its head, its ears perked, and the forester would see certainty in its gaze. No danger here, and he would fall back asleep. But one day, the silence of the taiga was broken differently. It was not an owl and not the snow. A distant cry echoed across the snowy expanses. The wolf jumped up, the fur on its scruff bristling. The man understood, strange people. He stepped onto the porch and listened for a long time. The wind carried snatches of voices. Somewhere far in the dense forest, someone was walking on the icy crust. The forester knew that people didn't just wander into the taiga in winter for no reason. They were either hunters or poachers. He respected the former and hated the latter. The wolf stood beside him like a shadow, its eyes burning with a fierce light. "We stay quiet," the forester muttered. They returned to the cabin and put out the lamp. Outside, everything grew quiet, only the wind was playing in the tree crowns. But now a sense of unease had settled inside. The forester knew the strangers would be back. Days passed, and his anxiety was confirmed. One morning on the snow near the clearing, he saw tracks, wide, heavy human ones, and next to them drops of blood. That meant they had wounded an animal. The forester frowned, his heart clenching. He knew the poachers wouldn't stop. Returning to the cabin, he met the wolf's gaze and suddenly understood. The animal felt the same. There was no longer a wall between them. Their unease had merged into one. In the evening, the blizzard rose with renewed force. Snow piled up on the roof. The wind howled through the cracks. The forester sat by the stove and listened to the wail of the elements. The wolf lay nearby, but its eyes were wide open, seemed to be waiting. And when a muffled thump sounded at the door, they both jumped up. Someone was there in the blizzard. Heavy footsteps, a rustling sound, a brief conversation. The forester gripped his axe. The wolf let out a low growl. That night, no one dared to enter. But the forester understood that the boundary between his world and the world of strangers no longer existed. The taiga had prepared new trials for him, and now he was not alone. The taiga had a way of keeping silent. But if you listened carefully, warnings were hidden in that silence. The forester had known them since childhood. The dry crackle of bark before a frost, the strange rustling in the thicket before a blizzard, the desperate cry of a bird when a stranger was nearby. Now, every such warning beat within him like a heavy thrum. The poachers were somewhere close. The tracks he had found on the dirt road gave him no peace. Wide soles, blood on the snow, tufts of fur. He knew they had wounded an animal. Maybe a moose, maybe a cow moose, or even a bear lured from its den. Those who came to the taiga with greed rarely thought that living things had a right to peace. The wolf felt the anxiety more keenly than the man. Sometimes it would stand up abruptly at night, circle the cabin, return, and lie down again. Its fur would stand on end. Its breathing would become rapid. A fire flickered in its eyes. It heard what the man could not. The forester found himself thinking. The animal was not just a neighbor. It was like a living siren, a guardian you trusted without words. One morning, when the frost was severe and the air was as clear as glass, the forester went out onto the trail again. He hadn't even gone a mile when he noticed fresh tracks. They were getting closer to his cabin. The tracks were heavy, as if dragging something. And near an old stump he found a rifle shell casing. He clenched it in his hand and felt the cold of the metal, as if he were holding not a shell but a piece of someone else's malice. A bitterness rose in his chest. The taiga taught you to take only what you needed and always to let life live on. But these people took everything without thinking, without consideration. Upon his return, he sat by the stove for a long time, staring into the fire. The wolf lay next to him, and the same things that were in the man's heart were reflected in its yellow eyes. Anxiety and readiness. They both knew the strangers would return. And they did. In the evening, when the blizzard was rising, when the snow was obscuring the windows, when the wind was howling in the chimney, the door was hit with a rifle butt. First once, then again. "Hey, old man!" a rough voice shouted. "Anyone alive?" The forester didn't answer. The wolf got up, stood by the door, its fur bristling. A low growl filled the cabin. "Open up!" Another blow. We know you're in there. The forester gripped the axe tighter. His heart pounded in his chest, not from fear but from rage. He wasn't afraid for himself. He was afraid that this silence, this fragile world that he and the wolf had built, would be destroyed. Go away, he said in a low voice without getting up. Outside there was rough, drunken laughter. You go away, old man, the taiga isn't yours. The wolf growled louder, stepped closer to the door, and then they struck again. The boards creaked, snow fell from the roof. The strangers were drunk, arrogant, and certain that the taiga belonged to them. But at that moment the forester understood that they were no longer just two. They were a pack. Two, a man and a beast. If the strangers decided to cross the threshold, the taiga would greet them in the way it knew how to greet those who came with greed. It was quiet inside, only the crackle of the fire and a low growl. Outside there were shouts, laughter, heavy footsteps. The world stood still between two blows. The snow fell like a wall. The wind swept over the roof, howling in the cracks, as if the forest itself was warning. Don't break the silence. But the strangers didn't hear. They came with noise, with bravado, with guns and moonshine in their blood. The door rattled from the blows of the rifle butt. The boards trembled, the hinges creaked. The fire crackled in the cabin, its light casting dancing shadows on the walls. The forester sat on the bench, holding the axe, while the wolf stood by the door, breathing heavily. The fur on its scruff was bristling. Old man, one of them yelled. We know you're in there. Open up the easy way. There was no answer, only a growl. The wolf took a step closer. Its snout stretched out, its eyes flashed yellow. Outside there was laughter. Then another blow. The door bent inward. Snow from the roof fell like flour. Well, hold on, old timer, a voice said. We'll warm up your shack for you now. The forester got up. His heart beat calmly, as if he were going out on a familiar hunt. There was no fear inside, only a dull determination. The door cracked and a gap opened. A blast of snow and the rough smell of alcohol fumes rushed inside. The first silhouette appeared in the opening, a heavy figure in a sheepskin coat, with a rifle in its hands. The wolf lunged like lightning without a sound, just the whoosh of air. A shadow jumped onto a shadow and a cry rang out. The rifle went off, hitting the ceiling. Splinters rained down. The man collapsed on the threshold, gasping, trying to push the animal away. A wolf! The second one yelled, jumping back. He has a wolf in his cabin. At that moment, the forester stepped forward, swung, and brought the flat of his axe down on the hands that were reaching for the opening. Curses rang out. The rifle fell into the snow. The blizzard muffled everything, but inside every sound cut to the quick. The howl of the animal, the groans of the men, the crackle of wood, the thud of boots. The wolf held the first poacher by the shoulder. Teeth sank into the sheepskin. Blood splattered onto the snow. The second man tried to tear the door wider, but the forester kicked him, and he flew back into a snowdrift. Get out! The forester shouted loudly into the noise. The taiga isn't yours. But the strangers didn't leave. Outside, the shouts multiplied, the footsteps thundered. There weren't just two of them, there were more. One of them raised a rifle and fired. The bullet hit the doorframe, and a splinter struck the forester's face. The wolf lunged again, burst out onto the porch, and instantly hell broke loose outside. Shouts, howls, and gunshots. The blizzard blurred everything, making the fight blind. The forester rushed out after them. The wind lashed, the snow blinded, but he saw the fiery flashes of the gunshots and heard the roar of the animal and the screams of the men. The wolf darted like a shadow, lunging at one, then another, tearing up the space between them. One poacher fell, a black spot of blood spreading across the snow. Another screamed, swinging a knife, but teeth clamped down on his arm. The scream turned into a rasp. That damn beast! Someone yelled, firing blindly. The forester rushed forward, struck the rifle barrel with his axe, knocked it away, then leaned into the shooter with his shoulder. Both fell into the snow. Fists met a face and hot blood splattered on the white snow. The blizzard roared, and it seemed that the taiga itself had risen against the strangers. A vortex of snow blocked the view, branches broke, trees groaned. The fight lasted for several minutes, but for each of them, it felt like an eternity. In the end, the poachers couldn't take it. Those who were still alive began to retreat, dragging the wounded. Someone cursed, someone groaned. "Let's go," one of them shouted. "They're not people, they're devils." Their figures dissolved into the white haze. All that was left was snow, blood, and the traces of the fight. The forester breathed heavily, leaning on his axe. The wolf stood beside him, its entire chest heaving, its mouth bloody. Its eyes burned with a wild light. But it didn't rush on. It returned to the cabin like a guardian who had done its duty. The forester looked at it and understood. They were now bound forever by blood, by the fight, and by this terrible blizzard. After that night, an ominous silence reigned in the taiga. The snow covered all traces of the struggle, buried the bloodstains, drowned out the screams and groans. It seemed as if the taiga itself had decided to hide this violence, but the man and the beast knew. This was not the end. The forester would wake up at night because his heart had started beating too fast. He would sit on the bench and listen. Outside there was a deathly silence. But the wolf would also raise its head and perk up its ears. Both understood that the strangers would not leave it at that. They would go, bind their wounds, become drunk with rage, and return. Each day turned into preparation. The forester fixed the door, installed new bolts, and reinforced the shutters. He chopped more firewood so he wouldn't have to go into the forest. He checked his axe, his knife, the old rifle that hung under the ceiling. There were few bullets, but they were there. The wolf went to the edge of the forest more often, staying there for hours. It sniffed the air, listened, and sometimes let out a long, low howl. That howl sent shivers down the forester's spine. It was a warning and a challenge. One afternoon, he heard a distant cracking sound. The forest hummed differently. The wolf stood up. Its fur bristled. The man went out onto the porch and froze. In the distance, among the white trunks, shadows appeared. A few figures were moving along the icy crust. "They've returned," he said quietly to himself. Slowly, surely. In the evening there were more of them. Now the forest was not empty. It was alive with a foreign breath. Somewhere a shovel gave a muffled thud, which meant they were setting traps. Somewhere a dry crackling of twigs was heard. That meant they were scouting the way. The forester understood. The poachers were serious. They were no longer afraid of a single wolf and an old man with an axe. Now they had come to hunt. The wolf roamed around the cabin, leaving tracks and marking the snow. Sometimes it would go into the thicket and return with tufts of a foreign scent in its fur. Its eyes gleamed with rage. It was becoming the shadow of the taiga itself. That night, when the moon rose over the forest, the strangers approached again. But this time they didn't hit with rifle butts. They surrounded the cabin. At first it was quiet, only the crackle of a campfire somewhere off to the side. Then a whistle sounded, then laughter. "Old man," someone yelled. "We're back. Did you think we'd leave?" There was no answer. Inside there was an awful silence. The forester sat by the stove, holding the rifle, with the wolf beside him. "Come out," they yelled again, "or we'll come in ourselves." And then torches were lit in the darkness. The flames danced, flooding the snow with red light. There were many poachers, 7, maybe 8. Their faces were twisted with malice, their hands clutching rifles and clubs. They moved unhurriedly but with determination. The snow crunched under their boots. The torchlight cast shadows on the trees. "Burn it," someone said. "He'll come out on his own." The forester's heart sank. He raised his rifle, aimed at a flame. A shot rang out, sparks flew, and one of the torches fell into the snow. The strangers yelled, someone fell. And at that moment the wolf lunged. Its shadow darted into the darkness. A cry rang out, then a howl. The snow was churned up, the torches waved, the flames swayed. The fight began again. But this time it was not a random skirmish. This time it was war. The forester fought alongside the animal. The rifle roared, the axe flashed, his hands burned from fatigue, and breath tore from his chest. The wolf moved like lightning, Now in front of him, now behind his back, tearing out foreign screams and leaving black spots in the snow. Torches fell, the snow turned crimson, the blizzard howled as if the taiga itself had risen against those who had violated its laws. And yet, there were many enemies. The forester felt his strength draining, his legs giving way. But every time he thought it was over, the wolf would stand beside him. Its growl kept him on his feet. Its look said, "Hold on a little longer." The night became an eternity, and only with the first glimmer of dawn did the strangers waver. The remnants of their pack retreated, dragging the wounded and abandoning their weapons. Silence once again descended on the taiga. But now it was a different silence, heavy and tense. The forester stood in the snow, covered in blood and hoarfrost, and saw the wolf beside him. Both were breathing heavily, but both were standing. He understood that it would get even worse. But now they had no way back. After that night, the snow around the cabin wasn't just a white blanket. It was a battlefield. Pieces of crushed torches, black bloodstains, broken branches. Everything was frozen in an icy crust like an amber. The forester and the wolf had stood their ground, but a feeling was maturing within both of them. This was just a respite. The forester knew the poachers would not forgive this. In the taiga they had their own truth. The strongest is the master. And if their shame went unavenged, they would lose their power over others. So they would come again. Not 5 or 7 but more. And they would come not just with clubs and torches but with real weapons. The days became like waiting for a storm. The forester repaired the roof, set traps on the paths, stacked logs, and checked his rifle. His hands only trembled from the cold, not from fear. He had lived his life in the taiga and he knew. There are enemies with whom you have to go to the end. The wolf went farther into the thicket, sometimes returning with tufts of a foreign scent in its fur, sometimes with scratches on its snout. It was watching for every sound. Its howl at night was no longer just a warning. It was a challenge. The taiga echoed, and it seemed that the entire forest was preparing for a decisive battle. One morning, the forester heard a low rumble. The earth seemed to be shaking. He went out onto the porch and saw a line of people stretching from the forest. 20 of them, maybe more. With rifles, with axes, with iron. They walked like an army. Dogs strained at their leashes, barking and tearing up the snow. "So they came," he muttered. He closed the door and looked at the wolf. It stood in the middle of the cabin, its eyes burning, its breath misting the air. There was no longer a boundary between the man and the beast. It was a pack. Outside, shouts, barking, and gunshots in the air thundered. The poachers surrounded the cabin in a tight circle. "Old man," a voice cut through the noise. "This time you're finished." The forester raised his rifle and sat down by the window. His heart was beating steadily. If this was the end, let it be an honest one. The first shot shattered a shutter. Snow and splinters flew inside. The wolf growled, lunged toward the door, and hell began. The dogs were the first to rush the cabin. Black shadows flashed in the blizzard. Fangs gleamed. The wolf flew outside, and at that moment the snow turned red. Roaring, whimpering, howling, everything mixed together. The wolf darted between them, breaking one's neck, tearing another's side. The forester fired through the gaps in the shutters. Every bullet found its target. The strangers fell, screaming, but the others kept coming. Torches flared up again. The flames licked at the roof. The forester grabbed a bucket and poured water on it, but it instantly turned to steam. The boards hissed. "Wolf!" he shouted, not even realizing he had called it out loud, as if it were a comrade. And it heard. The animal lunged back, knocked one man down. Then another burst inside and stood with its chest to the door. They were together like two rocks against which a wave was breaking. But the wave was huge. The poachers pounded on the door. Shots hit the walls. Bullets tore at the wood. The forester felt exhaustion clinging to his shoulders. But the animal was breathing next to him. Every growl gave him strength. At some point the door shattered. 2 men burst into the cabin. One had an axe, the other a knife. The forester struck the first one's face with the rifle butt. Blood splattered on the wall. The wolf lunged at the second, knocked him down, and the crackle of bones mixed with the scream. But new men were climbing in behind them. The flames were already catching the roof. Fire danced on the walls. Smoke choked his throat. And then the blizzard rose as if the taiga itself had decided to intervene. The wind tore at the torches, the fire went out, and snow poured through the cracks. In the storm's wail, the forester heard something more, as if the forest itself had taken them under its protection. The poachers screamed. The wind lashed their faces. Snow beat at their eyes, and the wind broke their formation. The wolf lunged into the thick of it. Its shadow flashed between them like death itself. People fell back, stumbling, dropping their weapons. "Let's go!" A desperate cry was heard. "To hell with it! These aren't people, they're a curse." The blizzard carried their cries away. One by one, they disappeared into the snowy haze. Only wreckage, blood, and silence remained. The forester fell to his knees in the snow. The wolf stood beside him. Its chest was heaving, its mouth was covered in blood. They looked at each other and knew. This is the end of the war. The taiga had not given up the cabin or their lives to the strangers. But it had exacted a terrible price. Bodies lay all around. The snow was black and red, and a heaviness settled in the forester's heart. He did not rejoice. He simply understood that he and the wolf were now linked forever. When the blizzard subsided and the sky cleared, a cold, pale moon rose over the taiga. The snow glistened like 1,000 shattered mirrors, and each piece reflected the night that had passed. The forester sat by the cabin, leaning on his axe, with the wolf lying next to him. Both were silent. Both were breathing heavily, as if every breath was painful. But in this silence there was something sacred. The snow around them was scarred. The traces of the struggle, the dark bloodstains, the broken torches, the weapons abandoned in haste. Here, a battle had taken place not only between men and beasts but also between two worlds. One was greedy and insatiable, the other silent, severe but just. The taiga had made its choice. The forester looked up at the sky. The moon watched from above, a mute witness. He remembered his life, the long years of solitude when he thought the taiga had accepted him only as an extra. How many times had he asked himself, why all this? Why these winters, the snow, the endless cold, the empty nights by the stove? And he suddenly understood that everything had led him to this night. If he hadn't saved the half-dead animal from the snowdrift, if he hadn't brought it into the cabin, if he hadn't offered a hand without hope of thanks, he would not have lived to see this dawn. The wolf had saved him just as he had saved the wolf, and now they were equal. The wolf raised its head. Its eyes flashed in the moonlight, not like an animal's but something ancient, like the taiga itself. It looked at the forester and slowly closed its eyelids. The forester reached out his hand, touched its neck, and for the first time in many years said out loud, "Thank you, brother." The wind carried the echo of that word into the thicket, and it seemed the forest answered with a rustle of branches. The next days passed in silence. The poachers were gone forever. Those who had survived did not dare to return. In the distant villages, they might whisper about the terrible taiga, about a guardian wolf and the old forester who had fought off a whole gang. But no one dared to go deep into that taiga to check, because in those places if you stand by a campfire at night and listen you can hear a howl. It comes from somewhere far away, fades in the branches and rises into the sky. There is no threat in that howl. There is sadness and truth. And then the old people nod and say quietly, "That's him, the forester's wolf, he's still on guard." And the children fall silent, huddling closer to the fire, because they feel it's not just a fairy tale, it's the memory of the taiga.